Several police sheriffs across America have been sentenced to prison for serious crimes, and their betrayals will shock you to your core. These are the men sworn to protect and serve, who instead chose to abuse, corrupt, and kill the very people they were entrusted to safeguard. When we think of criminals behind bars, we don't expect to find sheriffs and deputies among them. Yet across the United States, law enforcement officers at the highest levels have been convicted and sentenced for crimes that range from federal cover-ups to driving innocent people to their deaths. The combined sentences for these corrupt sheriffs exceed 30 years in federal and state prisons. Their crimes span the full spectrum of law enforcement corruption, from lying to federal investigators about systematic jail abuse, to torturing detainees with restraint chairs, to racial profiling entire communities in defiance of federal court orders. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the truth behind those who abuse their authority. Today we reveal the corruption, the cover-ups, the civil rights violations, and the deadly negligence that sent America's sheriffs to prison. From LA County's massive jail scandal that reached the highest levels of law enforcement, to deputies who killed with their recklessness and thought their badges would protect them from consequences. These cases represent more than individual failures. They expose systematic problems within American law enforcement that have cost lives and destroyed communities. Each sheriff and deputy on this list held positions of ultimate authority in their jurisdictions, commanding respect and wielding power over life and death decisions. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. These law enforcement leaders chose to betray their oaths, violate constitutional rights, and in some cases, directly cause the deaths of people in their custody or care. The timeline of these cases spans from 2017 to 2023, proving that corruption at the sheriff level isn't a historical problem. It's an ongoing crisis that continues to undermine public trust in law enforcement across America. These are the people we call when we need help, but who do you call when they're the criminals? When the very individuals sworn to uphold justice become the ones who need to be brought to justice themselves. From federal conspiracies to cover up abuse to deputies who drove vulnerable patients into deadly floodwaters, these cases will challenge everything you thought you knew about law enforcement accountability. The badge was supposed to represent honor, integrity, and service. Instead, these sheriffs turned it into a shield for criminal behavior that would have landed ordinary citizens in prison for decades. Case 1. Lee Baca. He ran one of America's largest sheriff departments, commanding over 18,000 employees and overseeing the nation's biggest jail system. But Lee Baca's decades of respected law enforcement service came crashing down when federal investigators discovered he was leading a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice and hide systematic abuse from the FBI. For years, Baca had been the face of Los Angeles County law enforcement, a sheriff who projected authority and competence while managing a department responsible for policing over 10 million residents. His jurisdiction included not just patrol duties, but operation of the massive LA County jail system that housed tens of thousands of inmates. But beneath the professional exterior, Baca was running a criminal enterprise disguised as law enforcement. When the FBI began investigating reports of abuse and civil rights violations within LA County jails, they discovered a culture of violence and corruption that reached the highest levels of the department. The federal investigation revealed shocking conditions inside LA County jails, where deputies routinely beat inmates, denied medical care, and created a climate of fear and brutality. Inmates were subjected to excessive force, sexual abuse, and deliberate indifference to their basic human needs. When the FBI planted an informant inside the jail system to gather evidence of these abuses, Baca and his subordinates discovered the federal operation. Rather than cooperating with the investigation or addressing the problems, Baca chose to obstruct justice and hide the informant from federal authorities. The cover-up involved multiple high-ranking officials within the sheriff's department who worked together to conceal evidence, intimidate witnesses, and prevent federal investigators from uncovering the full extent of the abuse. They moved the FBI informant to different locations within the jail system, changed his name, and tried to make him disappear from federal oversight. Baca personally participated in meetings where department officials discussed how to hide the informant and obstruct the federal investigation. He was aware that his deputies were committing serious crimes against inmates, but instead of stopping the abuse, he focused on preventing federal authorities from discovering it. The conspiracy included attempts to intimidate FBI agents themselves. Sheriff's Department officials approached FBI agents at their homes, trying to pressure them to abandon their investigation. This brazen interference with federal law enforcement demonstrated the extent to which Baca believed his position made him untouchable. When federal prosecutors finally brought charges against Baca, the evidence was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, witness testimony, and documentary evidence showed his direct involvement in the conspiracy to obstruct justice and hide civil rights violations from federal investigators. Initially, Baca attempted to fight the charges, claiming he was unaware of the extent of the problems within his department. But as the evidence mounted, he was forced to admit his role in the conspiracy and plead guilty to lying to federal investigators. The federal judge who sentenced Baca noted the severity of his crimes and the betrayal of public trust they represented. As the elected sheriff of Los Angeles County, Baca had sworn to uphold the Constitution and protect the rights of all people in his custody, including jail inmates. Instead, he had presided over a system of abuse and then worked actively to hide that abuse from federal oversight. His actions violated the civil rights of thousands of inmates and undermined the integrity of the entire criminal justice system in Los Angeles County. In 2017, Baca was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, though his sentence was later reduced due to health issues related to Alzheimer's disease. The relatively light sentence sparked controversy, with many arguing that someone who had overseen such systematic abuse deserved harsher punishment. The Baca case exposed fundamental problems within one of America's largest law enforcement agencies and led to ongoing federal oversight of LA County jails. His conviction sent a message that even the most powerful law enforcement officials could be held accountable for criminal behavior. But the damage to public trust was immense. Baca had betrayed not just his oath of office, but the faith that millions of residents had placed in him to protect their safety and uphold justice. Lee Baca transformed from respected law enforcement leader to federal criminal, proving that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. Case 2. Victor Hill. What he did to helpless detainees defies belief. Victor Hill, the sheriff of Clayton County, Georgia, turned detention into torture by ordering inmates strapped to restraint chairs for hours without legal justification, transforming a legitimate law enforcement tool into an instrument of cruel punishment that violated every constitutional protection. Hill had built a reputation as a controversial and aggressive sheriff who wasn't afraid to use unconventional methods to maintain order in his jurisdiction. But his approach to managing detainees crossed the line from tough law enforcement into outright torture that would eventually land him in federal prison. The restraint chair is designed as a safety device for situations where detainees pose an immediate threat to themselves or others. When used properly, and for limited periods, it can prevent self-harm or violence. But Hill perverted this legitimate tool into a method of punishment and intimidation. Under Hill's orders, detainees were strapped into restraint chairs for extended periods, sometimes hours at a time. not because they posed any immediate danger, but as punishment for minor infractions, or simply because Hill wanted to assert his authority over them. The victims of Hill's torture were people who had been arrested for various offenses and were being held in Clayton County detention facilities. They were legally presumed innocent until proven guilty, yet Hill subjected them to treatment that would have been considered torture if inflicted by a foreign government. But many of the victims weren't contingent. The restraint chairs immobilized victims completely, strapping down their arms, legs, and torso so they couldn't move. Being confined in this way for hours caused severe physical and psychological distress, including circulation problems, muscle cramps, and panic attacks. Hill's use of the restraint chairs had no legitimate law enforcement purpose. The detainees weren't threatening anyone or trying to harm themselves. They were simply people who had angered Hill, or whom he wanted to intimidate through the infliction of physical and psychological suffering. Federal investigators who examined Hill's practices discovered a pattern of abuse that violated the constitutional rights of multiple detainees. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, while the 14th Amendment guarantees due process and equal protection under the law. By ordering detainees tortured with restraint chairs, Hill violated both constitutional protections. He was inflicting cruel punishment on people who hadn't been convicted of any crime, and he was denying them the due process protections that every person in custody is guaranteed. The federal civil rights investigation revealed that Hill's abuse wasn't limited to isolated incidents. He had created a culture within the Clayton County Sheriff's Office where constitutional rights were routinely violated and detainees were subjected to treatment that amounted to torture. Witnesses testified about the physical and emotional trauma inflicted by Hill's restraint chair torture. Victims described the terror of being completely immobilized for hours, unable to move or escape, while suffering physical pain and psychological distress. The evidence against Hill was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors had documentation of his orders, witness testimony from victims and deputies, and medical evidence of the harm caused by prolonged restraint chair confinement. When the case went to trial, Hill's defense team tried to argue that he was simply using available tools to maintain order in a difficult detention environment. But federal prosecutors demonstrated that his actions had no legitimate law enforcement justification and were purely punitive. The federal jury convicted Hill of violating the civil rights of detainees under color of law, a serious federal crime that carries significant penalties. The conviction reflected the jury's recognition that Hill had abused his authority as sheriff to inflict torture on people in his custody. In 2023, Hill was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for his civil rights violations. The sentence reflected the seriousness of his crimes and sent a message that law enforcement officials who tortured detainees will face federal prosecution. Hill's case highlighted ongoing problems with abuse in detention facilities across America and demonstrated that federal authorities are willing to prosecute sheriffs who violate constitutional rights. His conviction was particularly significant because it occurred recently, showing that accountability for law enforcement abuse continues today. The victims of Hill's torture will carry the physical and psychological scars of their experience for the rest of their lives, while Hill's conviction serves as a reminder that the badge doesn't provide immunity from prosecution for criminal behavior. Victor Hill learned that turning detention into torture transforms a sheriff into a federal criminal subject to the same justice system he once represented. Case 3. Joe Arpaio. He thought he was above federal law. Joe Arpaio, the self-proclaimed America's toughest sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, built his career on aggressive tactics and media attention. But his systematic targeting of the Latino community and defiance of federal court orders ultimately led to a criminal conviction that exposed the dangerous consequences of unchecked law enforcement power. For over 2 decades, Arpaio had cultivated a national reputation as a tough-on-crime sheriff who wasn't afraid to use controversial methods. He operated tent city jails in the Arizona desert, made inmates wear pink underwear, and regularly appeared on television promoting his hard-line approach to law enforcement. But beneath the media-friendly persona, Arpaio was running a law enforcement operation that systematically violated the constitutional rights of Latino residents in Maricopa County. His deputies conducted traffic stops, workplace raids, and neighborhood sweeps that targeted people based solely on their perceived ethnicity. The racial profiling operation was extensive and deliberate. Arpaio's deputies would stop vehicles driven by Latino individuals without any legitimate law enforcement reason, demanding identification and immigration documents. They conducted raids on businesses that employed Latino workers, often detaining people who were legally in the United States. These practices violated the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, as well as the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law. Arpaio was essentially creating a separate system of law enforcement that treated Latino residents as presumptively criminal. The systematic nature of the racial profiling caught the attention of federal civil rights investigators, who filed a lawsuit challenging Arpaio's practices. The case presented overwhelming evidence that the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was engaging in unconstitutional discrimination against Latino residents. In 2013, a federal judge issued a comprehensive injunction, ordering Arpaio to stop the racial profiling practices immediately. The court found that his department had violated the constitutional rights of thousands of Latino residents and ordered specific reforms to prevent future discrimination. The federal injunction was clear and unambiguous. Arpaio and his deputies were prohibited from detaining people based on race or ethnicity, and they were required to implement new policies and training to ensure constitutional compliance. The court also appointed a monitor to oversee compliance with the order. But Arpaio refused to comply with the federal court order. Despite being explicitly told to stop racial profiling, he continued the discriminatory practices and publicly stated his intention to ignore the federal judge's commands. His defiance was both deliberate and public. The continued racial profiling after the federal injunction demonstrated Arpaio's belief that his position as an elected sheriff made him immune from federal oversight. He seemed to think that his popularity with certain voters gave him the right to violate constitutional protections for minority residents. Federal prosecutors charged Arpaio with criminal contempt of court for willfully violating the federal judge's order. The contempt charge reflected the seriousness of his defiance and the threat it posed to the rule of law and judicial authority. During the contempt proceedings, evidence showed that Arpaio had not only continued the racial profiling, but had actively concealed his violations from the federal court. He provided false information about his compliance and attempted to hide ongoing discriminatory practices. The federal judge who heard the contempt case found Arpaio guilty of criminal contempt, concluding that his violations of the injunction were willful and deliberate. The conviction carried a maximum sentence of 6 months in jail, though Arpaio never served the time. In a controversial move that sparked national debate, President Donald Trump pardoned Arpaio in August 2017, just months after his conviction. The presidential pardon eliminated Arpaio's criminal liability, but couldn't erase the federal court's findings about his constitutional violation. The pardon was particularly controversial because it came before Arpaio had been sentenced, and because it involved a case where a law enforcement official had defied federal court orders designed to protect constitutional rights. Arpaio's case highlighted the tension between local law enforcement and federal oversight, as well as the challenges of holding elected sheriffs accountable for constitutional violations. His conviction, even though ultimately pardoned, established important precedents about the limits of law enforcement authority. The Latino residents of Maricopa County, who were subjected to Arpaio's racial profiling, suffered lasting harm from his discriminatory practices, while his defiance of federal court orders undermined respect for judicial authority and the rule of law. Joe Arpaio's transformation from media-savvy sheriff to convicted criminal demonstrated that even the most politically popular law enforcement officials must respect constitutional limits on their power. Case 4, Stephen Flood. He was supposed to transport them safely to a psychiatric facility. Instead, Stephen Flood, a Horry County, South Carolina deputy, drove vulnerable patients directly into deadly floodwaters, causing multiple deaths through reckless negligence that earned him the longest prison sentence on this list, 18 years behind bars. The victims were individuals experiencing psychiatric crises who needed professional care and treatment. They had been placed in Flood's custody for transport to a facility where they could receive help. These were some of society's most vulnerable people, completely dependent on law enforcement to ensure their safety during the journey. Flood was responsible for transporting these patients during a period of severe weather, when flooding had made many roads dangerous or impassable. Weather warnings had been issued throughout the region, alerting drivers to avoid flooded areas and take alternative routes to ensure safety. Despite the clear weather warnings and obvious flood conditions, Flood made the fatal decision to drive directly into floodwaters with his passengers. This wasn't a split-second mistake or an unavoidable accident. It was a reckless choice that any reasonable person would have recognized as extremely dangerous. The transport vehicle became trapped in the rising floodwaters, creating a life-threatening situation for everyone inside. The patients, who were already in vulnerable states due to their psychiatric conditions, found themselves trapped in a vehicle filling with water while unable to escape or help themselves. Multiple patients drowned as a result of Flood's reckless decision to drive into the floodwaters. These were preventable deaths that occurred because a law enforcement officer chose to ignore basic safety protocols and weather warnings that would have kept his passengers alive. The investigation into the deaths revealed that Flood had multiple opportunities to choose safer routes or delay the transport until conditions improved. Weather services had issued clear warnings about flood dangers, and alternative routes were available that would have avoided the deadly waters. Flood's decision to proceed, despite the obvious dangers, demonstrated a level of recklessness that went far beyond poor judgment. He had a duty of care to protect the vulnerable individuals in his custody, but instead, he placed them in mortal danger through his negligent actions. The families of the victims were devastated by the preventable nature of their loved ones' deaths. These individuals had been seeking help for psychiatric conditions, not expecting that the very people supposed to protect them would cause their deaths through reckless negligence. Prosecutors charged Flood with involuntary manslaughter and reckless homicide, reflecting the serious criminal nature of his actions. The charges acknowledged that while Flood may not have intended to kill his passengers, his reckless behavior directly caused their deaths. The case highlighted serious problems with protocols for transporting vulnerable individuals during emergency conditions. The deaths exposed gaps in training and procedures that put patients at risk when weather or other factors created dangerous conditions. During the trial, evidence showed that Flood's actions violated basic safety standards and common-sense precautions that any reasonable person would have taken. Expert witnesses testified about proper procedures for emergency transport and the obvious dangers of driving into floodwaters. The prosecution argued that Flood's recklessness was so extreme that it constituted criminal behavior deserving of significant punishment. The deaths were entirely preventable and resulted from Flood's conscious decision to ignore safety warnings and endanger his passengers. Flood's defense team attempted to argue that he was trying to complete his assigned transport duties and didn't intend to harm anyone. But the evidence showed that his decision to drive into floodwaters was so reckless that intent was irrelevant to his criminal liability. The jury convicted Flood on multiple counts of involuntary manslaughter and reckless homicide, finding that his actions directly caused the deaths of the patients in his care. The convictions reflected the community's recognition that his negligence had crossed the line into criminal behavior. In 2022, Flood was sentenced to 18 years in prison, the longest sentence among all the cases on this list. The harsh punishment reflected both the number of deaths he caused and the particularly vulnerable nature of his victims. The sentence sent a clear message that law enforcement officers who cause deaths through extreme negligence will face serious criminal consequences. Flood's case established important precedents about the duty of care that officers owe to people in their custody. The psychiatric patients who died in Flood's transport vehicle were seeking help and treatment, not expecting that their journey would end in drowning because of one deputy's reckless disregard for their safety and basic precautions. Stephen Flood transformed from a law enforcement officer into a killer through negligence so extreme that it became criminal, proving that badges don't protect those who cause preventable deaths through reckless actions. Case 5. James O'Brien and Adam Loon. A routine transport became a death sentence when Boulder County, Colorado deputies James O'Brien and Adam Lunn killed a detainee through improper procedures that caused asphyxiation during what should have been a safe journey to jail. Their negligence cost a life and earned them both prison sentences for manslaughter. The victim was a person who had been arrested and was being transported to the Boulder County Jail for processing. This individual was alive and breathing when placed in the custody of O'Brien and Lunn, trusting that these law enforcement officers would follow proper procedures to ensure safe transport. Prisoner transport is one of the most basic responsibilities in law enforcement, with established protocols designed to protect both officers and detainees during the journey. These procedures exist specifically to prevent injuries and deaths that can occur when proper safety measures aren't followed. O'Brien and Lunn violated fundamental transport safety protocols, placing the detainee in a position or restraint configuration that restricted breathing. Their actions demonstrated either ignorance of basic safety procedures or reckless disregard for the life of the person in their custody. The detainee began experiencing breathing difficulties during the transport, but O'Brien and Lunn failed to recognize the medical emergency or take appropriate action to save the person's life. Their failure to respond properly to the crisis contributed directly to the victim's death. Asphyxiation deaths during police transport are entirely preventable when officers follow established safety protocols. The victim died not because of any medical condition or unavoidable accident, but because two deputies failed to perform their basic duties competently. The investigation into the death revealed that O'Brien and Lunn had violated multiple safety procedures during the transport. Their actions fell so far below acceptable standards that prosecutors determined their negligence constituted criminal behavior. Both deputies were charged with involuntary manslaughter, reflecting the prosecution's determination that their negligent actions directly caused the detainee's death. The charges acknowledge that while they may not have intended to kill, their reckless behavior resulted in a preventable death. The case highlighted serious deficiencies in training and supervision within the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. The fact that two deputies could make such fundamental errors suggested systemic problems with how officers were prepared for transport duties. During the legal proceedings, evidence showed that proper procedures would have prevented the death entirely. Expert witnesses testified about established safety protocols and how O'Brien and Lunn's actions violated basic standards of care. The prosecution argued that both deputies bore responsibility for the death because they were jointly involved in the transport and both failed to follow proper procedures or respond appropriately to the medical emergency. O'Brien and Lunn's defense teams attempted to minimize their client's responsibility, arguing that the death was an unfortunate accident rather than criminal negligence. But the evidence showed their actions were so far below acceptable standards that criminal liability was appropriate. The victim's family suffered the devastating loss of their loved one due to the preventable negligence of law enforcement officers who were supposed to ensure safe custody. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that proper procedures could have prevented the death. Both deputies were convicted of involuntary manslaughter in 2021, with the jury finding that their negligent actions directly caused the detainee's death. The convictions reflected the community's recognition that law enforcement officers must be held accountable for preventable deaths. O'Brien received a 6-year prison sentence, while Lunn was sentenced to 3 years, reflecting their different levels of responsibility for the fatal transport. The sentences demonstrated that courts will impose serious punishment for law enforcement negligence that results in death. The case established important precedents about the duty of care that law enforcement officers owe to people in their custody. It showed that officers who cause deaths through negligence will face criminal prosecution and significant prison time. The Boulder County transport death exposed fundamental problems with officer training and supervision that put detainees at risk during routine procedures. The case led to reviews of transport protocols and additional training requirements. The detainee who died in O'Brien and Lunn's custody was someone's family member, friend, and community member whose life was cut short by law enforcement negligence that violated basic standards of professional competence and human decency. James O'Brien and Adam Lunn learned that causing preventable deaths through negligence transforms law enforcement officers into criminals, subject to the same justice system they once served. 6 law enforcement officers, 6 betrayals of public trust, 6 reminders that the badge doesn't place anyone above the law. From federal conspiracies to cover-up systematic abuse to deputies who killed through reckless negligence, these cases expose the dark reality of corruption at the highest levels of American law enforcement. The combined sentences for these sheriffs and deputies exceed 30 years in prison, reflecting the severity of their crimes and the court's recognition that law enforcement officers who violate their oaths must face serious consequences. Lee Baca's 3-year sentence for federal conspiracy, Victor Hill's 18 months for civil rights violations, and Stephen Flood's 18 years for causing multiple deaths through negligence demonstrate the range of criminal behavior among those sworn to protect and serve. These cases span from 2017 to 2023, proving that corruption within sheriff departments isn't a historical problem, but an ongoing crisis that continues to undermine public safety and constitutional rights. Joe Arpaio's contempt conviction for defying federal court orders, though later pardoned, established important precedents about the limits of law enforcement authority. The victims of these crimes represent the full spectrum of vulnerability. Jail inmates subjected to systematic abuse, detainees tortured with restraint chairs, Latino residents targeted for racial profiling, psychiatric patients killed through transport negligence, and communities whose trust in law enforcement was shattered by those who were supposed to protect them. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is how each officer exploited their position of authority to commit crimes that would have been impossible without their badges. Baca used his role as LA County Sheriff to obstruct federal investigations. Hill turned detention tools into torture devices. Arpaio weaponized traffic stops for racial discrimination. Flood and the Boulder County deputies caused preventable deaths through negligence that violated basic duty of care. The geographic spread of these cases from California to Georgia, Arizona to South Carolina and Colorado, demonstrates that law enforcement corruption isn't limited to any single region or department. The problem exists wherever officers believe their authority makes them immune from accountability. These sheriffs and deputies thought their positions protected them from consequences, but federal and state prosecutors proved that no one is above the law. The convictions send a clear message that law enforcement officers who commit crimes will face the same justice system they once represented. The systemic nature of some crimes, particularly Baca's LA County conspiracy and RPO's racial profiling operation, reveals how corruption can infect entire departments when leadership fails to uphold constitutional principles. These cases highlight the critical importance of federal oversight and accountability mechanisms. The human cost extends far beyond the immediate victims to include families destroyed by preventable deaths, communities traumatized by abuse of authority, and the erosion of public trust that affects all legitimate law enforcement officers who serve with honor and integrity. Reform efforts following these convictions have led to improved training, enhanced oversight, and stronger accountability measures in many jurisdictions. But the fact that these cases continue to emerge shows that more work remains to be done to prevent future abuses. The question isn't whether there are more corrupt sheriffs and deputies out there. It's when they'll be exposed and held accountable for their crimes. These 6 cases represent only the ones who got caught and convicted, suggesting that additional corruption may still be hidden within law enforcement agencies across America. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Do you think the sentences were appropriate for the crimes committed? And most importantly, what reforms do you believe are necessary to prevent future law enforcement corruption and protect the constitutional rights of all Americans?